Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Stephen McInerney. I'm the Executive Director of POMED, the Project on Middle East Democracy. Thank you for joining us for today's event, examining the political crisis underway in Tunisia. And thank you for bearing with us as we're starting a few minutes late due to some technical difficulties. Central to the mission of our organization, POMED, is examining how genuine democracies can develop in the Middle East and North Africa. For the past decade, one of the top priority countries for our work has been Tunisia. As you all know, since 2011, Tunisia was the only country to remain on the precarious path of democratization beyond a couple of years. But as anyone who's followed Tunisia closely has seen, there have been deeply troubling signs for Tunisian democracy in recent years. Our last event on Tunisia was on January 14th of this year, the 10th anniversary of its revolution. The panelists at that event mentioned remembrances of the exciting days of end of 2010 and early 2011, and some of the remarkable progress made since. But also they noted the many failures of Tunisia's political elites to meet the public's expectations over the past decade, especially regarding corruption and economic and social justice. All of these problems have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, which has hit Tunisia hard in successive waves, the most severe wave hitting the beleaguered population over the past couple of months. Mounting frustration and anger over these overlapping crises and anger at public institutions crippled by endless infighting among politicians led to protests and violent clashes culminating 11 days ago. On July 25th, President Kais Saïed took dramatic steps with the support of Tunisia's military, granting himself full executive powers. In addition, he dismissed the prime minister, froze or suspended the parliament, and removed immunity for members of parliament. Saïed invoked Article 80 of the Constitution to take these extraordinary measures, though some of his actions, most clearly the freezing of Tunisia's parliament, are explicitly prohibited by that very article of Tunisia's constitution. As such, Tunisian democracy now faces its most serious crisis yet. To help us examine this situation, we have a panel of three excellent Tunisian speakers joining us live by video from Tunisia. Our first speaker will be Amna Ghelali. She is Amnesty International's Deputy Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa. She will be followed by Ashraf Awadi, Tunisian activist and the founder of iWatch, a watchdog anti-corruption organization founded just after the 2011 revolution. And our third speaker will be Mohammedia Hamami, an independent researcher and analyst who's also been a journalist, a parliamentary assistant in the National Constituent Assembly, and a researcher for Tunisia's Truth and Dignity Commission. Their full bios are available on the event page of our website. We'll start with a question for each speaker on the events of the last 11 days in Tunisia, and then we'll shift our focus to the coming period. Time permitting, we'll take questions from the audience. If you have a question, please submit it either through using the Q&A button on Zoom, or you can email us at communications@pomed.org. Okay, I'd like to pose my first question to Amna. Amna, could I just ask you to very briefly describe what the mood and the atmosphere are like now on the ground in Tunisia? And what are the most serious concerns at the moment, including things that may not be clear to those of us trying our best to follow events from abroad?
Thanks very much, Steve. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. You already mentioned some of the contextual elements that I wanted to share with you for the first, to answer to your first question. I think it is important to note, and you already mentioned some of these elements, it's important to note that long before the 25th of July, Tunisia's democratic process, which is in the works since 2011, was already in shambles. And for many analysts and observers, the democratic process itself was derailed a long time ago when the political elite and rulers decided to transform democracy into a ruling by consensus. However, the ruling by consensus, even if theoretically could be positive because it has avoided to the country the kind of chaos and descent into civil war that we saw in other contexts and in countries of the Arab Spring, was hijacked by several political parties and influential figures and transformed into transactional consensus. So a consensus that doesn't serve really the interests of the country or the interests of the nation, but serves the interests, the very small interests of the rulers themselves. And that's why we saw these this total rejection of the political elite and dissatisfaction with the governance of Tunisia, including with the really disastrous way the government dealt and handled the COVID-19 crisis. And that's why there was in the beginning, so after the announcement of the president, his announcement to suspend the parliament, to dismiss the government, and to hold the executive powers, they were met with a lot of joy and celebration in the streets of Tunisia because people were fed up with the status quo, because they were completely disenchanted with the democratic process, and they feel the need for something different, for a new impetus to the democratic process. It doesn't mean that most people are against the democratic process itself. They see it as totally perverted by a corrupt political elite, and that Kais Saïed is going to give it a new impetus. That is the kind of, a general feeling for many in Tunisia. And for another portion of the Tunisian society, I think they responded to the announcement with concern and fear for the democratic process, because however dysfunctional, ineffective, and flawed the process was, it was considered by many as the only way forward and as a new system of governance that is based on power sharing and negotiation and consensus, even if this word seems like something that many in Tunisia came to despise. And for many also, the decisions of Kais Saïed are the antithesis of this process and of the democratic process, because it's going back to the concentration of powers into the hands of one man, especially with the announcement that he will also have, authority over the judiciary, that he will preside over the prosecution services. Even if he retracted later from that kind of announcement, it's still something that hangs there as, like an alarming bell for the future of democracy in Tunisia and for the future of rule of law more generally, because obviously this concentration of power does, is a recipe for authoritarian rule, especially with the lack of any checks and balances that were envisaged in the Constitution of 2014 to limit the powers of the president or the powers of other institutions. The Constitutional Court, as we know, has not been set up because of the political quarrels and the lack of political will to put it in place, because also there was this showdown lately between the president and the parliament, and he didn't want to pass the new law on the Constitutional Court. So we have this institutional gap that does not allow for a healthy, checks and balances on the acts of the president, and how this will translate later is difficult to say, because we don't have yet a clear roadmap. We don't know what the plans of the president are. And I must say that while the general mood was one of genuine celebration for a large portion of the population after the president's announcement, as the days go by, the lack of a clear roadmap becomes a source of concern for many in the country. And so to date, we have no head of government. We have also daily dismissals and nominations of new ministers or mayors or other high-ranking people inside the state apparatus, including security forces, but without any explanation of the rationale for such dismissals or such nominations, which makes people wonder what is why there were such dismissals. And in order to have a buy-in from the population, obviously we need the president needs to unveil his plans and to explain why such dismissals took place. It is also very important to note that there are no declared negotiations with political parties, and even if the president has invited the powerful, civil society networks such as UGTT to a dialogue, it did seem more like a monologue than a dialogue, because the lack of clear negotiation around the roadmap this was one of the main deficits in terms of the vision for the future of Tunisia as per the president's plans. So I think the general mood right now is really one of waiting to see what will happen next, and with a lot of concern and fear for the democratic process.
Okay, thanks very much, Amna. And next question for Ashraf. I think we might be having some technical difficulties, but we can't see Ashraf, but I believe we should be able to hear him, and he can hear us. So Ashraf, my question for you is, well, you've put an enormous amount of effort over the past decade into fighting against corruption in Tunisia. And the organization that you founded, iWatch, has played a leading role in that fight. There's been a lot of rhetoric, including from President Kais Saïed himself, about the need to hold accountable those guilty of corruption. On the other hand, transparency and independent, credible judicial processes that adhere to the rule of law are essential in combating corruption anywhere in the world. And the current political environment seems, very lacking in transparency. All decisions seem to be coming from the rather opaque sort of black box of the presidency. And of course, the extra constitutional and extra legal basis for recent actions call into question the rule of law. In addition, President Kais Saïed has proposed financial settlements with businessmen accused of crimes of corruption and theft from the state, which some have compared to similar effort to economic reconciliation led by the late President Beji Caid, and that were widely viewed as undermining accountability for corruption. I'd love to hear sort of, briefly your thoughts on all of this. How do you see the recent events since July 25th from the perspective of the fight against corruption in Tunisia? Ashraf, are you there with us?
Can you hear me, Steve?
Yes, I hear you now. Yes. Could you hear my question?
Perfect. Yeah, I did hear your question. So as I just said, it's always a pleasure to join you guys in POMED, and we're doing a great job actually keeping people informed in Washington, D.C. and in the region in general. So whatever happened on the 25th, as an organization, actually for us, we decided not to qualify it because it's still a very ambiguous fight over the constitution. But for us, definitely corruption is something that somehow fed that or led into it. And then, to be honest, like when things happened, we started with sharing a roadmap with the president saying, if you are serious about fighting corruption, then this is the way you should do it. And then we suggested few quick measures that he can implement in 30 days. But if we go to the pre-25th of July era, as you already mentioned that, Steve, it was an amnesty law that Kais Saïed put in place. The leading party, Nahda, was putting together what they call actually the total amnesty. And they brought one of the prominent figures of the old regime, Mohammed Ghariani, as an advisor to Rashid Ghannouchi in order to draft a version of this law. Same thing for the president. He's also preparing his own amnesty law for businessmen. So I think when it comes to fighting against corruption, first we should link it to a failed transitional justice process. Unfortunately for the nation, that we did not have a good functioning transitional justice process. So that's why we never moved on over the past and the crimes of corruption of the past. Of course, in the past 10 years after the revolution, somehow we created our new corrupt class of politicians and businessmen, and that also needs to be addressed. And you do all this in a context where the judiciary is not independent. So you got judges, and the high and the most ranking judge in the country is now prosecuted for fraud and corruption. The second most prominent job is also prosecuted for corruption and crimes related to terrorism, and mainly for links to the leading political party Nahda. So if you remember, Steve, when I was in DC, when I got the POMED prize and we had that round table, I've always mentioned the same thing. There's a lot of romanticism in speaking about the situation in Tunisia, and it's always when every time a Tunisian would speak his mind, you will have always the ready answer telling us, yeah, but you're better than Egypt, and keep comparing Tunisia to Egypt and other somehow sad stories did not really help us. And then people talk about Tunisia in a lot of romanticism and speaking about the democratic experience and transition in Tunisia. I think, as I've said it 2 years ago in DC, let me say it again now, there's no democracy during which people die in detention, during which the security force did not undergo the right reform, in which you still have the judiciary dependent to the executive branch, in which you still have people managing to get away with it, and impunity is the norm. So hearing and reading what people are saying about the 25th of July as if we need to go back to democracy, I'm not sure we had democracy. We had elections. And elections with a lot of fraud, and so many reports talk about it. So that's why, for me, let's be clear. If you want to do Tunisia a favor, let's end with this tone of romanticism that's fake in the whole situation. Tunisia is not a democracy. It's a country struggling to put its transition on the rails, on the right path, and we are still struggling. Corruption is one issue, but it's a lot of other issues related to campaign finance, to political parties, to terrorism, to a ruling party that has been really corrupt. The last law that the parliament passed before being frozen by the president actually was a law to catalyze the economy. It got rejected by the central bank. The central bank went public and said this law is not going to help Tunisia in the international community. So this is really a parliament that somehow is enacting laws to justify corruption. This is the same parliament that refused, despite all the requests from iWatch or Bawsala and other civil society actors, to put in place a constitutional court, because we were lucky once when the president died in 2019. We were lucky once to have a pacific, peaceful transition of power. Despite the fact that at the time we needed a constitutional court, because the constitutional court was the entity and is the entity by the constitution and according to the law to declare that position is vacant. But that was not the case. So for me, we were given a few chances to somehow respect the law, have the constitution in check, have the constitutional court. But unfortunately, that greed for power by the politicians and by the political class led us to where we are now. So now I'm writing that piece I promised you, Steve, on that op-ed I promised you, and then the op-ed is called the original sin. Who sinned first? Is it the president? Is it this parliament? The previous parliament? So now, as civil society, we're somehow a victim of series of dysfunctional systems and political compromises somehow, but it's leading us and left us with a dysfunctional situation. And now we found ourselves in a situation when the president abused the constitution, justifying it by fighting corruption and fighting this elite. At the same time, you are now in a crossroad. You don't know where to go. What would be next? Are we going to respect the 30 days? Are we going to dissolve this parliament? Whatever is going to happen in the upcoming days is going to be really, really bad for the transition and for the rule of law in the country. And then having those arrests happening this way, seeing civilians prosecuted by military courts, whatever is going to happen next, the transition in Tunisia is tarnished. Are we expecting that the president is going to fight corruption? I don't think so. Because he lacks the understanding of corruption. He lacks data. The president's staff, his short staff, he still did not appoint a prime minister. Hopefully he does it in the upcoming few hours/days. But my first impression, I'm not sure he's going to be able to fight corruption because he lacks the understanding of it. Yet maybe he would speak better than I on this and the relationship between businessmen and the political elite. But to me, I think he lacks the understanding and he lacks the tools, the legal tools to do it. And you cannot put all people in jail and all those accused of corruption. You cannot put them in jail and try them in front of a military court because simply that's not how democracy functions. So in my opinion, if the judiciary, they do not step in and lead this fight, nothing would change. And then we will be in that situation when the president would try maybe to increase the period of the 30 days to another 30 days maybe. And then the international community will start asking tougher questions. We've been hearing voices in the Congress about punishing Tunisia and sanctioning Tunisia and then ending aid to Tunisia. And those voices will keep on increasing if they don't see a roadmap. So I think this is the time when Tunisia would need all its friends to support it for this path of democracy. I wish I could give you a clearer answer, guys. And maybe I'm creating more confusion than I should, or maybe you're expecting something, actually a voice from Tunisia to reassure people about what's going on. But I think I have as many questions as you guys. And for me, I'm not really that optimistic, but I'll say we'll be vigilant and we'll be monitoring closely what's going on. But I'm not optimistic that there will be a fight against corruption in the upcoming days or months.
Okay, thanks very much, Ashraf, for your comments. And I would just, just a few thoughts before I turn to the next question. Certainly I agree with you that the international community, the West, certainly including the United States, I think has certainly been guilty of this sort of romanticization of Tunisia over the past decade. I think our organization tried to, along with some others, tried to sort of strike the balance between applauding the important progress that was made and then highlighting that Tunisia's democratic transition was not complete and has never been complete. And I think we always sort of referred to Tunisia's democratic transition as underway. And unfortunately, it seems to have largely been stalled for the past several years after a lot of important progress in its first, 4 or 5 years. But unfortunately, I think you're exactly right that the world did compare Tunisia too much to the very low bar set by its neighbors, and was a bit complacent about many of the problems and issues that have been kind of bubbling over in Tunisia for some time. Mohammed Dia, I'd like to turn to you now. One thing that I think makes all of these events that are underway now sort of a bit extra challenging to follow and to understand is that first, the steps are being taken in an extremely opaque manner. And on top of that, President Kais Saïed, who is driving this process, is a bit of an unusual figure and not very well understood. Frankly, some of his rhetoric seems contradictory. He's spoken about radical decentralization of power, and then at other times he's called for a stronger presidency. And his recent actions seem to have dramatically expanded his own powers as president. I know that Kais Saïed is someone that you followed closely for a long time. You were among the first Tunisians who I remember predicting that he was likely to win the presidential elections in 2019. There's been a lot of talk about Kais Saïed using his powers that he seized to transform Tunisia's political system. If you could briefly highlight for us, what do we know about Kais Saïed's political thinking and his ideas about governance? And based on that, if he were to try to push forward significant changes to Tunisia's political system, what might that look like, and what kinds of changes do you think he would prioritize?
Thank you for having me. Well, I think these are great questions. And like you said, I try to follow Kais Saïed at least aside from the last months before the election of 2019. And I think the only way to understand some of his ideas, and I'm not saying here that he is necessarily coherent, is to go back to his first political statements and declaration that he made starting from the revolution on the eve of the election of the National Constitutional Assembly. So we can find several videos where he explained his rejection of the post-2011 process. He disagrees with the way the Ben Ashur Commission that was in charge of the drafting of the electoral law somehow prepared the organization of the election by giving the priority to political parties. So he stands against a political system where the basic entity is a political party, and this idea is becoming more and more popular. And he considers them mostly as anti-revolutionary, as tools of power grabbing, as political machines that give access to some phony candidates who are not necessarily revolutionary, give them access to power, or simply he alluded to some political parties who are mostly interested in having access to the presidency. So this is the kind of idea that we have. So in addition to this, to his opposition to political parties, he is inspired from councilism, which is an idea that was at some moment marginally popular among some leftist organizations in Europe. It's not that prevailing anywhere in the world right now, except maybe in his circles. He's not the only one who actually is in favor of this radical decentralization. We find other thinkers who are more recognized as thinkers than necessarily him, like Gilbert Naqash, a Tunisian Marxist leftist thinkers from the perspective movement of the 60s, who recently died, who shares this kind of views of necessity to radically decentralize. But the big question here, this might look as interesting ideas to discuss about in intellectual circles. They seem nice. They are incoherent with his rejection of ideas from overseas, the kind of maybe decolonial rhetoric, but in reality, he's actually taking a lot from Western thought, not necessarily mainstream ones. So the big question is he really intending to push for the implementation of this alternative system? We don't know. He may change his views in the middle of the road. That's a possibility. He may start by trying to change the electoral law to make it to somehow exclude political parties. He wants to organize elections on individual-based lists and not party-based lists. He mentioned more than once, including after his election, that he wants to amend the constitution. He was explicit about it, even in the anniversary of the revolution in Sidi Bouzid in 2020, shortly after his election. So he may try to do that, but that's also a very risky, adventurous, and probably costly journey that not necessarily everyone here, or at least we're not sure that we have a critical level of support for this kind of project. And even if he starts this journey, it's not guaranteed that we will land in a safe era. Maybe the process in which he wants to engage would break in the middle, and we find ourselves with a different type of regime, maybe an extra super presidential system, similar to the one we used to have, or it's not clear. So I think he's taking too much risk. Yeah. So regarding your last question on the form on the measures that should be taken to maybe change the political system, I think we didn't even try to implement ours, the one that was chosen in 2014. We don't have a constitutional court yet. We couldn't elect and implement the several independent constitutional institutions that play the role of counterbalance to corrupt businesses, like the new anti-corruption organization, or that guarantees the rights of future generation. So I think on paper the current constitution is great. Taking the risk to change it to something else is not necessarily guaranteed. And also we should keep in mind that almost 11 years after the adoption of Tunisia's first post-independence election, Bourguiba himself started attacking his own constitution, and he passed constitutional reforms to even concentrate power and to remain president for life. So reforms to constitutions are not necessarily the solution.
Thanks very much, Mohamed Dia. Amna, I'd like to come back to you. From the perspective of human rights of Tunisia's citizens, what would you say are the most important things that you'd like to see in this coming period, in the days and weeks ahead? And on the other side, maybe kind of what potential steps would you find the most alarming, the most important things for Tunisia to avoid?
Sorry, do you hear me? Yeah, I hear me now. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think from the perspective of human rights, obviously on paper, the concentration of powers that are now in the hands of Kais Saïed poses a risk, and as I said before, is a recipe for abuse. And there are there is obviously a fear of backsliding on rights and freedoms in Tunisia, and the achievements of the democratic process, even if again very flawed and ineffective. But there were several steps undertaken in order to improve on human rights. And we need to consolidate those instead of backsliding. And so one of the early signs that we might be monitoring and watching very closely is the potential for abuse during arrests and prosecutions or fair trials, issues for those who are accused of corruption or are accused of threatening state security, and that there are many investigations in place right now. Some of the worrying signs are the fact that there is an over-resort right now and kind of politically motivated resort to the military courts, to the military trials. And we know the role that the military courts have played, like during the authoritarian era and the dictatorship. They continued to play some kind of role even during the first phases of the transition. They never ceased to prosecute civilians and to do political trials, basically for opinion and for Facebook posts and for different speech offenses. But the fact that now we saw several investigations opened inside the military tribunals against parliamentarians after the president lifted their parliamentary immunity, does raise an alarm, sound an alarm bell, and is a source of concern, because the military tribunals are not reformed. They are still under the purview of the Ministry of Defense, and they are completely, they can be completely manipulated by the executive branch. This is not to say that the civilian judicial system is better, because one of the major problems that we have faced in Tunisia over the period of the democratic transition, the 10 years of the democratic transition, is the fact that the judiciary has not been entirely reformed. And even if there were reforms, there was these reforms were only cursory, in my view, and not very deep. And the creation of a high judicial council that is seemingly independent did not really create an independent judiciary, because of the kind of corrupt network of judges that were not illustrated or were not reformed, and there is still like a residual corruption inside the judiciary. So this is one of the areas where we need to pay much attention, because everything that Kais Saïed has announced so far in terms of lifting the immunity on the parliamentarians, his early announcement of presiding over the prosecution services, the activation of the military trial machine, military justice machine to prosecute parliamentarians or other influential figures, is kind of goes into the same direction, which is the undermining of the rule of law, because obviously all of these are procedural breaches and attempts to diminish fair trial guarantees, and which is really problematic, because we all want to see impunity ending in Tunisia. The impunity was endemic, and it was really one of the major problems for the democratic process, one of the major threats to the democratic process. The fact that many of the people holding power were absolutely not held accountable for any of the past, offenses, or the offenses committed even, or the seeming offenses that they have committed during the transition. This is one of the major problems. So we all want to see impunity ending. We all want to see justice done for both the victims of terrorism and the victims of for corruption, for state depredation of the wealth of the country. But we don't want to see that done through exceptional measures, because the only way for this democratic transition to continue and to have a new impetus is to have accountability, but through really sound mechanisms of justice, and not expedited, unfair trials of opponents that do seem like settling of scores, and will only lead to the kind of authoritarianism that we have seen in the past. So, so far, I must say that the fears or concerns that we had after the announcement of massive arrests or crackdown did not really materialize. And obviously, there were few arrests MPs who were then investigated before the military court, but they were released immediately after that, and the investigations are ongoing without having them in prison, which is is not the kind of crackdown that one could expect after such announcement. The other issues that we have noticed in the beginning, like the closing down, for example, of the Al Jazeera offices, the following day after the announcement of the suspension of the parliament, there was no further acts or other decisions to close down other news outlets, which does also send some comforting message, or at least lowers down the alarm. And the other thing that is problematic was the decree that the president has taken, a few days after the announcement, which is the prohibition of the gathering of more than 3 people. And in principle, it was to prevent the spread of COVID and to protect public health. But at the end, it's also something that could impact the ability of Tunisians to take to the streets and to protest against the coup. So if this situation and this decree is extended or will be applied for a long period of time, then it's really problematic, because it will prevent gatherings and will encroach on freedom of assembly. So these are, generally speaking, the kind of steps or the decisions that Kais Saïed has taken, which are problematic. I think it's too early to say right now, as the two other speakers said, in which direction we are going. There are really very big risks for the democratic process and for freedoms and rights in Tunisia, but at the same time, Tunisians have learned during the 10 years of the democratic process how to fight for their rights. And I think there are, even though there are no counterpowers right now, and the fact that there are no checks and balances like the Constitutional Court, civil society is quite strong in defending the rights and freedoms. And maybe it's wishful thinking, but I do hope that it's going to be, it's going to set some boundaries on the concentration of powers that can be risky for democracy.
Okay, thanks very much, Amna. We have about 10 minutes left. At this point, I'd like to shift. I'm going to ask some of the questions that have come from the audience. If I could just ask all of our speakers to try to keep your answers to the audience questions very brief, so that we can try to fit in several of them in the short time that we have left. The first question sort of builds on some of Amna's comments. Was question sort of directed toward Ashraf. And Ashraf, earlier, you noted that the judiciary should be taking the lead on many of the issues rather than President Kais Saïed. And the question is, what court do you think has the jurisdiction and the purview to address these issues? We've seen some cases against Saïed's decree filed with an administrative tribunal already. Do you think this body would be able to take the lead? And of course, this question comes in the context of the glaring absence of a constitutional court. So Ashraf, any thoughts on kind of which courts would play this role?
To be honest, for the administrative tribunal, what we did actually is we wanted the dismissal of the head of this court, because we believe he's not really neutral. I think he's rather attached to another political party rather than he is someone who is working for the interests of the general interest of the Tunisian people. So that's why for us, the issue has been in the past 10 years, there was really an attack to the trust of the Tunisian people to the judges. So now I think if it's a war against corruption, it should definitely be led by le pôle judiciaire financier, which is an institution that is normally investigating financial corruption mainly and financial crimes. If we are talking about you challenging an administrative decision like the decisions and the decrees issued by the president, definitely it should be addressed to the administrative tribunal. But the issue has been not only the bias of this tribunal, but also you feel like these guys, they somehow do the math before taking decisions. So because you cannot impose on them any deadlines, so they just remain silent and let the wave of anger pass. So let's suppose that now we need a verdict from them in the upcoming 30 days, and the law actually forces them to respect the deadline of 30 days, they will not respect it. And this has been the habit of this tribunal. And then you see them acting in a really, really weird way, because if you want to understand the rationale behind their actions, you cannot see it, you cannot find it, because you feel like it depends on who's suing, depends on who's the person that has been sued. So that's really an issue, to be honest. And then with the absence of the constituted court, we find ourselves somehow compelled to accept decisions from people who are not necessarily known for their neutrality, which means this would give the streets a louder voice, which means that now people will not accept these decisions, will not challenge them in an institution, they will challenge them in the streets. So now my fear that the rule of law, because nobody believes that there is law that has been implemented in Tunisia and respected, is going to be challenged by the street and by the protesters. So whatever next the president might take, I think there will be protests supporting the president in a way that it will undermine institutions and it will undermine bit by bit democracy. And why we're here again, the original sin, because the judiciary, instead of preserving their independence and sending strong messages of independence to Tunisian people, they did not. I remember we sued, we challenged the decision made by the prime minister. He increased the salaries of the judges in a very inconstitutional way. So we went to the administrative tribunal. They went on TV and said, we're gonna make our verdict in a month. It's been 3 months now. So again, unfortunately, because the institutions are weak, or the institutions are part of the problem, you find that the street is a way for the president potentially to impose his agenda. And again, I'll end it with the same remark. Whatever is going to happen, if this scenario happens, this definitely will undermine and weaken the institutions, which means when we try to go back to democracy, we will need to start a democracy by trying to strengthen the institutions, which means we're going back to the beginning. We're going back to 2011, 12, as if we need to build institutions from scratch. But again, it's an issue of trust. The Tunisian people do not trust not only this elite, they do not even trust the institutions.
Yeah, thank you, Ashraf. Next question, I'd like to direct to Mohammed Dia. We've been talking a lot about the actions of Kais Saïed, and who's obviously driving events in recent days. But I'd like to ask you about sort of the actions, reactions, responses of other actors in the Tunisian political landscape. And again, we don't have a lot of time, but if you could just sort of briefly outline for us what you're seeing in terms of the reactions, responses from political parties opposed to Kais Saïed's actions, maybe led by Ennahda, which has been the strongest political party in the country in successive elections. Also, in terms of the reactions of the civil society sector, of the security sector, what are we seeing in terms of other parts of the political landscape?
Thank you. Well, political parties are divided between three groups. Political parties who called it the coup, like Ennahda, as you said, but they're not the only ones. For example, the former PAC, the former Communist Party, now called the Workers' Party, also use the word coup. Safi Saïed, the pan-Arabist, comparative to Saïed, he was candidate to the presidential election. He's now very popular. He also called it a coup. Several political actors called it a coup. Others are refusing to call it a coup, with more nationalists, whether Tunisian nationalists or Arab nationalist tendencies, refuse to call it a coup. And the majority, I would say, are refusing to use the word a coup, but at the same time, skeptical of Saïed's decisions. They don't use the word of the coup because they think it's not necessarily constructive. Going against Saïed in a confrontational way and call it a coup can be counterproductive, and does not leave a room necessarily to a discussion or dialogue. We saw several statements, and Intifada summarized, which is Tunisian media, summarized in a very interesting way. So several organizations called for the attachment to the constitutional legitimacy and the respect of the constitution. And among these, we find the Tunisian League of Human Rights, the Judges Association, and more importantly, UGDT, the strong labor union. Same thing, almost the majority called for a clear clarification of the roadmap. Where is he intending to go? And a timeline, more specifically, a focus on time. The organization working on law and human rights, like the Tunisian League of Human Rights and the Bar Association and the Higher Judicial Council and others, insisted on the independence of the judiciary. And this is extremely important because we're seeing Saïed going towards the military courts. It's one of the many ways to read it is that we don't necessarily have the full cooperation from the judicial side, not necessarily because of corruption, because they are corrupt, no, because also the Kais Saïed approach is not necessarily. So, like to sum it up, I don't think that many political actors fully trust Kais Saïed and are fully backing him. Even those who did not call it a coup were skeptical and called for rapid appointment of the prime minister and other measures. But at the same time, we should keep in mind that not all of that, there is another division on whether or not we should return to the post-2014 constitutional order. Added to that, the Ennahda. We saw some dissident voices of Ennahda opting for a kind of internal purge to avoid a purge of the entire party and its exclusion, but they failed to influence the Shura Council yesterday that is still in its position and refused to take radical measures, whether rapid reforms of exclusion of problematic figures in the party. So there are internal tensions within Nahda, but so far they could not take the party far from Rashid Ghannouchi's orientations. And finally, regarding the security forces, it's not clear yet what is currently going on. Several Mukhtar bin Nasser, a former retired military officer, said that that this was not done on the purse of the moment, but it was prepared, and the army is backing the president while remaining neutral, and that's extremely important word. Today, Le Monde, an article by Lila Blaise, quoted an anonymous source from former also retired military officer saying that some uncertainty is rising among troops regarding the concentration of power, but at the same time, they do support the recent moves, according to the article, and I'm paraphrasing here. And probably the most questionable and not well understood decisions made by Saïed have to do with his removal of two important key figures of the security apparatus: the Minister of Defense, who is also a law professor. He was removed shortly after the announcement of the July 25th decision, and also the chief military prosecutor, who is in charge of major procedure in the military justice. So this is so far the picture that we have on the, and also, sorry, I would like to add another point. On the business side, Saïed wanted, he met with several representatives of the banking and financial lobby, and at the same time, the representative of Utica, so to send kind of positive signs that he's willing to even pass kind of reconciliation law that based on some conditionalities and agreements. And Utica seems fully cooperative. They even decided to decrease the prices of goods as he demanded. But at the same time, when we look at individual business people and not the institution, we found that there is a skepticism. They didn't like the way he critiqued one of their members, Ali Kali, who was a banker and former minister of finance, the way he compared him to some corrupt ministers of the Bay. So so even if we see at the institutional level some kind of support to Saïed, inside the business circles, there is that level of skepticism and uncertainty that we should keep in mind.
Thanks very much. Unfortunately, I'm afraid that we're out of time. We have a number of other interesting questions that I'd love to hear the answers to, but maybe we'll have to explore it at another time. I just, first I'd like to thank all our speakers for joining us, particularly at such an intense and busy time in their country. We really appreciate them taking time out of their day to help kind of inform and educate those here in Washington or in the United States or elsewhere who are very interested in and concerned with what's happening in Tunisia and doing our best to follow the sort of dizzying array of events that have been unfolding day by day. So thanks again for all, the three of them for speaking. And thanks very much to all of you in the audience for joining us and also for bearing with us with some technical difficulties that we had today. We think it's very important to have speakers reporting to us from the ground live in Tunisia, but with that sometimes comes some technical challenges. Finally, if you began watching the event a bit late, if you were unable to catch the event from the beginning, or if you did have any difficulties viewing or hearing the event as it unfolded live, the full event will be available to view by video on our website. We will also have the full written transcript of the event available as well. So again, thanks all of you for joining us, and we look forward to staying in touch with all of you as we continue to follow this very, very difficult, challenging period in Tunisia. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.